Unlock your potential with these free classroom resources. The knowledge you need is right here.
Okay, welcome to Video Surveillance 101. Let's get started. So what is video surveillance? Video surveillance is the purposeful use of cameras and video recording systems to observe activity, detect abnormal or dangerous behavior, support response and decision making, and provide documentation after an incident. So the primary purposes here, the four primary purposes, are to deter, detect, respond, and investigate. And you'll remember deter, detect, and respond from the 5Ds that we've talked about in some other videos. Investigate is the fourth one, and that's the after incident actions that we take. So when you're selecting a camera or trying to build a system, you need to identify the purpose. You need to ask yourself, what purpose does this camera serve? Do I just want to see activity? Do I want to identify people? Do I want to identify data like license plates or truck numbers? Do I want to monitor behavior? Or do I want to collect evidence? And these are all important as you select your system. For example, when you consider camera placement, if you mount a camera in a high place, you may get deterrence because of its visibility, and it will allow you to see activity, but you likely won't be able to identify a person because of the large area of coverage. Conversely, if you were to place a camera so that it has a very refined field of view, perhaps looking at an entryway, it's going to improve your ability to identify, but it's going to limit your area of coverage. Then you have covert cameras. Covert cameras are cameras that are hidden. Those don't offer deterrence because, of course, no one knows they're there, but they are excellent for monitoring behavior because, again, people don't know the camera's there, and so they aren't behaving as though they're on camera. There's a few types of camera technology. The original camera technology was analog. It's a very low resolution, limited distance, very minimal technology regarding intelligence. Often it was called CCTV for closed circuit television. These systems are still in place today. You can actually still buy recorders and cameras that are just old analog cameras and recorders. I'm not sure why, because it's cheaper to buy better systems now, but they are still out there. If you come across an existing analog system and they want to update it to something better, one great solution is using HD analog. So HD analog for high definition, you can get up to 4K, which is 8 megapixels. So you can get up to 4K of resolution. You can reuse the existing coaxial cable. You can usually also reuse the existing power supplies. You still have minimal intelligence in the camera, but they're great for a retrofit case. Instead of having to recable a whole building or put a bunch of converters in there, you can use an encoder, use some high definition analog cameras, and upgrade that system for a very reasonable price that's going to produce some very excellent results. The common camera technology out there now for new, the modern technology is IP for Internet Protocol. IP cameras are high resolution. They have advanced analytics in them. They integrate with other systems, so access control and intercoms, alarm systems, weapons detection systems, right? There's huge integration opportunities with cameras, IP camera technologies. They have a lot of intelligence in them, but they do introduce a network risk because they are a network device. And we'll talk a little bit more about that a few slides from now. So there's 5 components of every camera, and that is the sensor, the lens, the aperture, the iris, and the processing engine. You can kind of think of it like your eyeball. So light, just like with your eye, is going to enter through the lens. The quality of that glass in the lens, the size of that lens are all going to affect how much light comes in and what that field of view is. Then you've got your iris, and just like the iris in your own eyeball, the iris adjusts the amount of light that's come in by changing the size of the aperture. So the aperture of a camera is like the pupil in your eye. Smaller means less light, wider means more light, and all that light goes to a sensor that converts the light to electrical signals, which is very much like your retina. Then those electrical signals are sent to a processing engine that converts those signals into usable video data and metadata, which is what your brain does. So again, the camera, very much think of it just like your own eye and just like how you see images yourself. Cameras, especially the IP cameras and newer technology, are rated generally in pixels when it comes to resolution. So resolution is the number of pixels in an image. 1920 by 1080. If you have a television that's 1080p, that means it's 1080 lines of progressive scanning, right? So 1920 by 1080p means that there's roughly 2 million pixels or 2 megapixels. The size of a pixel does matter. So some of your lower end cameras may say that they're 4K, but the sensor is smaller, so the pixels that's capturing are also smaller. Whereas the higher end cameras that are also 4K, because again, the 4K is 4,000. It's basically 8 million pixels is what 4K is, right? So a larger pixel also means more light and a better image. So two cameras that are both rated 4K, one with a larger sensor is still going to have a better image. Then another thing to consider is your pixels per foot. So pixels per foot is the number of pixels across the image divided by the width of the image. So the example of the camera up above, the 1920 is the width, the 1080p or the 1080 is the height. So 1920 would be the width in pixels of that image. Where that's important is if you take, say, a 2 megapixel camera like we talked about, so it's 1920 by 1080, and it's viewing a 20-foot wide image, maybe a vestibule or something, right? You're going to have 96 pixels per foot. However, if you have a 4K camera, which is, again, 8 megapixels, so it's 3840 by 2160, if you're looking at a 100-foot wide image, say a parking lot, you're actually only seeing 38.4 pixels per foot. So that means that even though your 4K camera is a higher resolution camera, the detail that you're getting out of the camera image is actually better from the 2 megapixel. So you have to really consider not just the resolution of the camera, but also the field of view and the area of coverage that the camera is looking at to make sure that you're getting enough pixel density to have a high clarity, high detail image if that's what you need. Now, for this parking lot, you may not care about identifying people, right? You may only care about activity in the parking lot. You may just care that cars are moving or that, see what parking spaces are open, things like that. In that case, 38.4 pixels is plenty sufficient. But if you wanted to actually be able to ID someone, you're going to probably need to increase the number of pixels there to get a better image of their face. And so that's where lens selection comes in. Lens selection is how we determine our field of view. So a wide lens is going to have more area but less detail. A narrow lens is going to have less area but more detail. Typically, if you're looking at lenses, they're measured in millimeter sizes, and the smaller the number, the wider the field of view. So a 2.8 millimeter lens is very common for a fixed lens camera. Depending on the sensor size, a 2.8 millimeter lens is somewhere between 90 and 105 degrees for field of view. You may go to a 4, 6, 8, 12, 16 millimeter lens, right? And as you increase those numbers, the angle of the field of view decreases. And so 16 millimeter lens may all of a sudden only be 35 degrees, say, right? It's not just the lens that determines the angle and the field of view, though. It's also the sensor. And so you need to look at the actual specifications for the camera itself to determine what the true angle of that field of view is. And then you have to consider the distance so you can determine if you have enough pixels per feet in the area that you're trying to cover. When you're selecting cameras, they need to be selected and placed for intentional coverage. I understand that sometimes you want to cover a parking lot, you just want to see everything. But if you're trying to use a single camera to see everything going on, you won't be able to identify anything. So you need to really be intentional about how you're selecting and placing cameras to make sure that the camera is serving the purpose that you identified earlier and doing the job that it needs to do. Another concern is light. Just like your own eyes, less light means more difficulty seeing. So light is measured in lumens, and lumens measure the light output from a bulb or a fixture. Usually that is displayed on the bulb or the fixture or somewhere in the paperwork that comes with it. Lux measures the amount of light that actually reaches the surface of the object that you're looking at. And so a lux is lumens per square meter. There's also something called a foot candle, which is lumens per square foot. Typically, though, lux is the technology, or the terminology used when you talk about cameras. Lux, the amount of light that reaches an object, drops rapidly as distance from the light source increases. In fact, if you double the distance, if you say you go from 1 foot to 2 foot away from the light source, the lux at the 2 feet, which is double the 1 foot, is about 25% of where it was at 1 foot. And if you go to 4 feet, same, it's about 25% of where it was at 2 feet. So as you can see, lux can drop really rapidly across, say, a parking lot. You also need to make sure you're considering shadows and things like that, right? So having a light with a high amount of lumens may be great, but it may not give you the coverage you want because there's objects blocking it, like vehicles, parking structures, things like that. So instead of having one light that's got millions and millions and millions of lumens or whatever, instead of having one light out there the size of the brightness of the sun, maybe you need to have more reasonably several lights placed intelligently that are also bright, but now offer lux spread across the area instead of just coming from one location. When you don't have enough light, there's infrared. So many cameras, almost all new cameras, have infrared lights built into them so they can broadcast their own infrared, and they can, of course, then view that infrared light. Infrared is not a spectrum that humans can see. Some of the higher bands of IR you can, but generally the IR that a camera views, a human eyeball can't see. So the camera is converting that into an image that a human can see, and it makes it a black and white image. It does require there's an IR cut filter to switch between the normal and the IR. In newer cameras, this is built in, it's automatic. Cameras that have a fixed lens, it's already set up. But when you have a camera where you're swapping lenses out, sometimes this is something you have to take into consideration, that you have to readjust the IR cut filter to make sure that you're not getting a messed up image either when the cut filter is out, where the lenses are no longer balanced, or when the cut filter is in and the lenses now are no longer balanced, and so the image becomes blurry. Insects, rain, snow, they all have a high amount of surface reflectivity, and surface reflectivity matters. So those items, insects, rain, snow, dust, things like that float in the air, they become highly visible and they make a lot of noise on the camera. If you have a camera that's set to record motion, you're going to detect a lot of motion because of all these objects. Even though they're very small, they're not truly motion. They are going to set off the motion on that camera. So IR is not often, it's not the best solution to see video, but it's better than no video, I suppose. Another thing to consider is that distance claims on cameras are often exaggerated. You'll see cameras that say that they've got, IR to 98 feet, or, I think I saw one that said 98 meters, which is closer to about 300 feet. That's probably not accurate because IR also is measured in lumens slightly differently, but you're right, it still has loss over distance, just like regular light does. So just because the camera says that's what it can see in IR, or I'm sorry, not what it can see, what it can broadcast in IR, doesn't necessarily mean that's true. And again, you're only getting a black and white image, so you're losing some of the quality of the image that you'd have if you had proper lighting. And that's why anytime you're putting together a system, a well-designed video surveillance system is going to include the addition of appropriate lighting and not reliance on infrared to get the images that you want. When you get the camera image, it comes into your recorder and it displays on your monitor. Sometimes you need to make some adjustments to it so the image looks correct. White balance is one of them. It adjusts the color accuracy. So if you think about these cars that drive down the road, some of them have blue or pink headlights, some of them have yellow headlights, most of them have white headlights. those are all the color of the light. It's measured in kelvins. It's the temperature of the light. So where daylight's typically about 6,500 Kelvin, soft lighting might be more like 3,500 Kelvin. Those blue lights might be in the 9,000 range, right? And so depending on the Kelvin temperature of the light that is covering the image, it may affect what the colors look like in the camera. And so white balance allows you to correct that so that the image looks the way that it should. There's also a wide dynamic range. So that balances bright and dark areas. These are very common. Maybe you have an entryway and it's all glass with a glass door, and so it's very bright outside and then darker inside because you just have regular interior lights, and so everything outside is washed out. Well, the wide dynamic range balances the bright and the dark areas and gets rid of some of that washout, so you can see what's going on through the glass. This is also helpful in areas that have a lot of cast shadows or some darker areas. It can balance that out. And then there's gain. So if you have a video signal that's not great, maybe the lighting isn't very good, gain will amplify that signal, but it also adds noise. And so then you have noise reduction. The problem with noise reduction is that it smooths an image, but it also removes some of the details. Every one of these image enhancements is a trade-off for something else. Typically, you're going to reduce the quality of the image, either the sharpness or the clarity, maybe the detail, by changing these settings. So this is where proper light, both in color and in illumination, is really important to make sure that you are getting the best video signal possible back to your recorder. Cameras come in a lot of different form factors. You've got domes, turrets, bullets, box cameras, panoramics, fisheyes, multi-imagers. Then there's more beyond this, of course, right? But these are the common ones that you'll see in a commercial environment. So domes, everybody's familiar with the dome camera. They're discreet. Usually mount them on a wall, maybe a ceiling. They're typically vandal resistant. You can get a smoked lens. So this one has a clear lens, but you can get a smoked lens. And that smoke lens allows you to obscure where the camera is looking. So that means that anybody can see the camera also thinks that maybe the camera can see them. That's very nice from a deterrence standpoint. One downside of them is that the IR illuminators are inside the glass dome where the lens is. And so when you turn those on, they tend to reflect in the glass. They tend to wash out some of that picture. So this is an example of, a dome is great until you want to try to turn on those IR lights, and maybe you're not going to get the picture you want. So it would have been better to just do the appropriate lighting. There's also turrets. Turrets are very similar in size to dome cameras. The nice thing about turrets is that the glass in front of the infrared illuminators is separate from the glass in front of the lens. These also often have their own white lights on them, and sometimes I've even seen red and blue. That can be used for an active deterrence or to eliminate a scene. This particular unit also has a microphone, which is the small dot to the left of the camera lens, and then it's got a speaker directly above the lens. So this allows you to both listen and talk. Now that speaker is probably not very loud, but for a quiet environment, it may be enough to communicate. Bullet and box cameras. People often mistakenly interchange these. I've been guilty of doing it myself. So a bullet camera is an enclosed unit, has a permanent lens, and it's basically ready for install as soon as you open up the package. A box camera, if you're going to install it outside, requires a housing. And the lenses on box cameras are interchangeable. So typically you order the box camera and the lens separately, and you order this in a way that's going to cover the scene that you want to cover, right? So you can see here a box on the left. It's box shaped. Obviously, it's not going to do well if you put it outside just like that. It's also not very vandal resistant because everything's exposed, but it does have the ability to add all sorts of different lenses to it. So you could go from a very wide field of view to a very long range field of view using the same camera. The bullet there on the right is going to have that fixed lens, but it also is all built into a housing. You can pretty much put that up on the wall right now. You probably noticed there's a lot of Axis cameras in this presentation. There's also some Uniview and some other camera brands. Axis was the original IP camera manufacturer. I think the first one they produced was like in 1996, and it was just a little box camera. And if you ever go to any of their Axis experience centers, they actually, all of them still have one of the original Axis cameras up and running on the monitor, and it's pretty cool. But anyways, no brand preference here, but they just happen to be a company that makes a lot of great cameras and is easy to grab pictures for the slideshow. Panoramic's another kind. So panoramic cameras are great if you need very wide horizontal coverage. This panoramic camera is a multi-imager as well. So typically you're going to get 180 degrees, 270 degrees, or 360 degrees of coverage depending on how the setup is. 270 degrees is great when you have a camera mount on the corner of a building and you need to see all the way around that corner. 180 is great for a camera mounted on maybe the middle of a wall, say a warehouse facility or something like that. And then 360 is great if you were to drop it in, say, the middle of a room. These are excellent for situational awareness, but they do have a limited ability to identify because they cover such a large area. Cameras like this, they de-warp the image, which is where they take a rounded image or multiple images stitched together and they try to make one rectangular flat image. So sometimes the image is a little bit misleading. If you have as an example, the one I saw had a sidewalk that ran perpendicular to ran parallel to the wall, so perpendicular to the way the camera is facing. And the sidewalk is perfectly straight, but in the camera, it looks like the sidewalk is curved because of the de-warping. And sometimes it also means that curved lines look straight. But if you're just looking for coverage of a large area, these are fantastic. You don't have to run one cable to them. They typically only take one license on the recorder, even though they bring back multiple fields of view. Another way to do panoramic viewing is with a fisheye camera. So a fisheye camera uses a single ultra-wide lens, usually about 2.1 millimeters. Remember I said the smaller the number, the wider the field of view. 2.1 is about the smallest when it comes to camera lenses because you're getting 360 degrees out of that, so you don't really need to go to much smaller. The true image that comes out of it, though, is a circle, and so it has to be digitally de-warped so that it makes sense to a person that's viewing it. And so you face some of the same de-warping struggles with these I mentioned with the other panoramic camera. But if you just want to get great coverage of a wide area without really needing to identify, these are fantastic. They also tend to be about the size of a smoke detector. And so if you install them on a ceiling in an office space, they're visible and they're overt. People know it's there, but it doesn't stand out because it's not like it's some huge device. It's about the same size as a smoke detector. It just blends right in. If you need to cover a large area, but you also need to have recognition, then a multi-imager camera is probably the way to go. So with a multi-imager camera, this particular one has 4 5-megapixel imagers in it for a total of 20 megapixels. You have multiple sensors that can be aimed with direction. The field of view can be changed, whatever you want to do. And it can produce one large image if you like. Now, often if you're not using it as a 360 degree, you're going to produce 4 separate images instead of stitching them together, because then the stitched image doesn't make sense. But these can be great for watching both a close area and something that's far away. So you can get that identification, that recognition when they're nearby, but you can also cover a large area like a parking lot. These work well on a light pole, on a parking lot, on building corners if you need to see all the way around at 370 degrees. On the side of a building to cover a parking lot. All fantastic solutions there. One downside of the multi-imager camera is because it does have more cameras inside it. Each of those imagers is a camera, so it has more cameras, which means it also has more bandwidth and it requires more storage on the recorder. But as long as you're building your network and your storage to accommodate for that, it's not a problem. As you order cameras, you'll see they have environmental ratings. That comes in it's called an IP rating. So the 6 that you see, the IP66, 67, 68, that 6, the first number there is your dust rating. Most cameras, I've seen a couple that come with a 4 there. Most cameras come with a 6 for that number, which means that they block all dust. I can think of very few reasons why I'd ever buy a camera that had less than an IP66 rating, unless it was going inside a housing that had an IP66 or greater rating. So the second number, that 6, is how much water it can block. And so IP66 blocks all dust and water. IP67 blocks all dust and temporary immersion. And IP68 can block all dust and continuous immersion. That does not mean that's an underwater camera. There are underwater cameras. I think they're usually rated like IP69. But you could drop this in a pool temporarily and pull it out and it'd still function. Typically, any outdoor camera I'm going to use, I want to be at least an IP67. That way, if you do get a significant rainstorm, if you get snow and ice built on top of it, whatever, you don't run the risk of having water get inside the camera housing. Cameras also come with an impact rating or a vandal rating. So people think of vandal rating and they think of, the lens being painted over and things like that. And certainly there are lenses that have film on them to reduce damage from paint or from things you can put on them. But typically when you're talking about IK for vandal rating, you're talking about the impact damage. So this is somebody trying to take a hammer to a camera or a baseball bat or a golf club or some other impact device to try to damage that camera. The rating goes from IK0, the lowest, to IK10, which is the highest. IK0 is no impact protection at all. IK10, I think it takes about 200 joules. So basically, you could hit it with a sledgehammer and probably not break it. You may break the mount that's attached to, but you won't actually break the camera itself. There's also a lot of specialized cameras out there. Thermal cameras, those detect a heat difference. They don't measure temperature though, so a thermometric camera measures temperature. Thermal cameras are great if you're trying to cover a large area, maybe an open field or something like that where it's really hard to see what's going on. Thermal cameras can see the heat off of a human or an animal or a vehicle or whatever. It can tell the difference between heat, so you can see an object that's hot that's out moving in an area, and then you can go investigate if you need to. It's also nice if you have someone trying to hide maybe in rows of shelving or behind a fence or anything like that. Thermal cameras will detect that heat signature even though a visible light camera may be difficult to see. Thermometric cameras are great because they actually measure temperature. So you can use a thermometric camera to watch for a fire or to look at a piece of equipment to make sure it doesn't overheat. Or conversely, you could use it to look at, say, a freezer to make sure that it's staying cold enough, right? So thermometric cameras are actually measuring the temperature. You have a bispectral camera, which combines both the thermal and the visible imagery. And typically it brings in two feeds. One is the thermal image that can either be like a black and white or color coded. You think of like the night vision that you see on TV shows, right? That's kind of what it looks like. The invisible image is what you see from a camera typically, and it can bring both of those in so you can see both the thermal against the visible and determine what's going on. And then there's multispectral cameras, and these are relatively new, really neat technology. They actually capture multiple wavelengths, and because of that, you can tell not just things like heat, but you can actually tell what the material is composed of. So you can tell metal from plastic, you can tell types of plastic from each other, you can tell types of metal from each other. You can tell types of liquids from each other, all based on the wavelengths of the light that comes off of them. So from a security standpoint, you could certainly use that to determine if somebody's trying to, hide a weapon disguised as something else. Maybe if they're trying to bring in a chemical claiming it's water, things like that, right? But it also has a use for food and vegetables that I saw in a presentation where you can actually look at a vegetable, like say an apple, and to the naked eye, the apple looks fine, but that multispectral can actually determine that inside the apple is started to rot or it's bruised or whatever. And so you know that apple is bad even though you can't see that the apple is bad. I thought that was a really cool application for this. There are documents on all 4 types of these cameras in the written content section of this classroom. And when you have time, I'd highly encourage you to read them. I think it's just fascinating technology, and it's really an enhancement to our already existing video technology that we have. Next thing to consider is storage. You need to determine how much time you need to store video for. That's the first question. Typically, it's a minimum of 30 days. That's usually sufficient for most places. However, there are certain times, maybe medical or legal practices, insurance practices that require longer storage periods. So you need to determine that before you start to try to calculate the size of your recorder and how much storage you want. I have had one customer that actually had to hold video for 1 year. As you can imagine, it's a significant amount of storage that was needed to do that. Once you know how much storage is needed and you know how many cameras you have, where they're going, what the resolution is, field of view, all that stuff, you can put them into a storage calculator and you can determine the storage capacity needed to meet the length of time. You can also, in most storage calculators, determine the bandwidth needed for the NVR to process all the video. When you're putting the data in, you need to consider the resolution of the camera, the frame rate you're transmitting, the compression coding of the camera, and then the recording method. So you can record cameras continuously, you can record on motion, you can record on events. A lot of times what I recommend is that you have a camera set up to record high resolution video on a motion event, but then to take low resolution snapshots every second when there's no motion, just so that you can see what's going on in case something is not tripping the motion. Your recording method is really going to be dependent on what your customer's needs are. Some customers are going to need constant recording all the time. That's just part of the requirement. If that's the case, if you needed a year of storage, constant recording, high resolution, high frame rate, you are going to be talking about, hundreds of terabytes of storage to get that video in there. Network design is also crucial. So your older systems, the closed circuit TV, right, the coaxial ones, there was not a network threat to those because they weren't intelligent devices. IP cameras are intelligent devices. They do reside on the network. So I always recommend you should put them on their own isolated LAN or at least on a VLAN. I prefer the isolated LAN where I've got a separate network switch and I've provided that network switch. That way I know that the switch has the capacity to pass the video, but also the capacity for the power for the cameras. And it keeps all that traffic off of the customer's network. Change the default password in your camera. I can't tell you how many times you've gone out to a site, somebody else installed it, customer needs help, click on the camera, and it's still the default password. That's handy for the next service tech, I suppose, but also handy for someone who's trying to hack into that system. You don't want to be the next Honeywell tech installer that's putting in a smoke detector or whatever in a Target and getting all the credit card data stolen, right? Don't make your company the one that makes the next news for some massive data theft. And then make sure that you record that new password and you store it securely. Make sure the customer has it. That customer bought that piece of equipment from you. You should not be withholding their passwords from them. That is one of the most ridiculous things I've ever seen. It shows a complete lack of integrity by integrators when they set a system up and don't give the customer the administrative controls to it. I understand if it's something maybe cloud-based where there's a subscription fee and you have to restrict that they can't add devices, or an alarm system where you have to restrict that they can't change devices because it affects how the system is monitored. But for a camera, there's no reason why you should lock that out so that your customer can't access their own equipment. It is absolutely ridiculous. While your newer cameras, highly intelligent. They have analytics and artificial intelligence built into them. Analytics adds intelligence to that video signal. You can get object identification, direction of travel, motion detection, behavior, and weapons detection. So object identification can be, is this a car? Is this a human? Is this an animal? Is it a bicycle, right? Direction of travel, that's huge. Watching the roadway, you want to make sure all the cars are going the same way. You're in an airport and you're looking at the exit lane from the secure area out to the concourse. You want to make sure that you don't have somebody trying to go in backwards and sneak and bypass the TSA checkpoint, right? Motion detection. Simple motion detection is a change in the color of pixels in the camera image, and if enough pixels change color, then that's motion. Intelligent motion detection can actually say, yes, this is an object that I classified as a human or a vehicle or whatever it is, but this is an object and it is actually moving, and then you can have true motion recording instead of just recording off the changes in pixels. You can also determine behavior. There are cameras that are smart enough to tell if people are loitering, if people are congregating where they shouldn't be, if people are showing signs of aggression. There's even ones for PPOE. So I'm sorry, not PPOE, PPE. Sorry, not PPOE, PPE, which is protective equipment, right? So, is that person wearing a hard hat? Are they wearing a safety vest? Things like that, right? And then weapons detection. Weapons detection is huge for schools. If someone has a gun, you want to know that they have that gun before they ever get inside your building. You want to see it in the parking lot. And that's a big part of where the right camera, the right selection, the right field of view is super important. But weapons detection is such a great tool for analytics on cameras that's come out. Another tool on cameras is facial recognition. The accuracy really varies. It's based on the intelligence of the camera. It's based on the intelligence of the NVR, whatever system is reviewing that data. But, if a person is wearing a hat and then not wearing a hat, the camera can't tell. If the person has eyeglasses and then doesn't, the camera doesn't know it's the same person, right? Same as shaving your beard, coloring your hair, all sorts of things. So a human still needs to verify these things, but the artificial intelligence does help to make some determinations. There are a lot of legal restrictions by jurisdiction on where you can and can't use facial recognition. So you need to make sure, if you're going to do it, consult legal counsel, make sure that what you're trying to do is legal. The state of Illinois, for example, requires that if you're using facial recognition, everyone has to give you consent for the facial recognition. Well, if you're talking about a small private office, maybe that's possible. If you're talking about a large venue, completely impossible. So in the state of Illinois, facial recognition is probably going to be a no. Other states have no regulation and you can just do and capture the information. So again, it's up to you as the professional to make sure that the system that you're installing meets legal codes. There's also audio recording. So there are a lot of cameras out there that can record audio. The laws on recording audio vary by state. Indiana is an example of a single party consent state. So only one person in the conversation has to know that it's being recorded. If no one in the conversation knows it's being recorded, then it's called eavesdropping. So if you don't want to get a federal eavesdropping charge, you either need to make sure that you tell every person that it's being recorded, or that you post signage that it's being recorded. Other states vary. There's also some restrictions on where you can record audio, because there are some places where there's an expectation of privacy. And again, it goes back to your state. If you're going to do audio recording, make sure that the end user is giving you permission, and make sure you consulted legal counsel to know that what you're trying to do is not going to violate law, because I don't think that's something you want to do as a security integrator. NDAA compliance is a big one. The National Defense Authorization Act. It's been around in multiple forms since 2001. Most recently, under I believe the Biden administration was, that they banned, actually, maybe even been earlier than that, but they banned Hikvision and Dahua and the third brand, I think it was Huawei or something like that. They are cameras that are made by companies that are owned or partially owned by the PRC, the People's Republic of China. And so there's a national security concern that those cameras could have back doors, that then the Chinese government could use them to view on military sites, view on national interest sites, view business secrets, view whatever, right? And so those cameras and those manufacturers have been banned. And that's not just the manufacturer with the brand name, but any OEM clone of that camera is also banned. Anybody that's got the chipware in it, basically. Non-compliance. If you have state or federal contracts, it's going to probably lead to a voided contract, possibly also a lawsuit, and it may create some legal exposure for you. You don't want to be the person who decided to go with the cheapest thing out there and install a really cheap camera, and then you've created some sort of national security concern. I'm not sure why anybody would ever brag that they spent the least amount possible on a security system. I'd rather brag that I spent the appropriate amount to buy the right system. There are plenty of other cost-effective camera solutions out there that are NDAA compliant, so just make sure that whatever cameras you're putting in, and this is for North America, sorry if you're internationally watching this, this is for North America, make sure that the cameras you're putting in are NDAA compliant. So again, some best practices. Identify the purpose of the camera. That's the first thing, right? If you don't know what the camera is supposed to do, you're not going to be able to select the proper camera. Make sure that you've selected the appropriate camera and then that you have sufficient lighting. Camera's no good if you can't get a good image. Plan your camera network. Like I said, private LAN, VLAN, secure your cameras, passwords, keep them off the internet, protect your camera network. And then, after you get everything set up, verify that the recording and all the intelligence are working. I usually like to do this right after I've set it up, and then the following day, and then a few days later, just to make sure. Check the overnight video, check, when lights are dark, just see how everything looks, make sure that everything's set up correctly. As the security professional, it's your job, it's your responsibility to make sure that this system is working optimally and working in the way that it was intended and designed. So the question for this is, how do you handle a scenario? This is whether you're the integrator, the end user, whomever. How do you handle a scenario where the available budget is not sufficient for the necessary video surveillance system? Thanks a lot for listening. Have a great day, and we'll talk to you soon.
Welcome to Vigilant Security Consulting.